Awesome. Thanks so much, Bonnie. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Dixit. Have long dark hair, wearing a white tank top. My pronouns are she, her. And today we're going to be talking about combating anti-Asian hate and racism. And I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves as well.
And my name is Ryann Louie. My pronouns are they and them. I have short black hair and dark rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a tan beige shirt with dots on them. And I have an Asian androgynous appearance. I'll pass it to Tia.
Hi everyone, my name is Tia Moua. I use the pronouns she, her, and today I'm wearing a pink shirt. I have long dark brown hair and I'm Hmong American.
Awesome. Next slide, please. So today we have some community guidelines for you all. The first one is that we're going to be talking about themes and stories about racial trauma and violence. So if you have to step out because the content is triggering based on lived experience, please do whatever you need to take care of yourself. For those who might feel uncomfortable hearing these topics, we invite you to embrace that feeling and maybe think deeply about the topics we talked about today and think why those feelings are coming up for you. Next slide, please. Awesome. And secondly, there will not be closure from today's presentation. The issues we will be talking about are very complex, and there shouldn't be an expectation that we can solve that in an hour. However, this is a really good first step if this is the first time you've ever dove into the issue of anti-Asian racism, and we encourage you to continue your learning beyond this. Next slide, please. So for today's agenda, we're going to be talking about API hate and racism, the history of it, how COVID has exacerbated the issue. We're going to talk about how our community is not a monolith, so the importance of disaggregated data within that. Then we're going to talk about how all of this should inform our work as APIC, the intersectional movements of solidarity that exist within this work, and then advocacy. And then what comes next for what the future of all of this looks like. And as Bonnie said earlier, questions can be placed in the chat or in the Q&A. We're going to have a dedicated time at the end for that. If you're someone who doesn't want to forget your comment or your question, feel free to drop it in there whenever, and we're going to address them at the end. And if you could, please include your name, your pronouns, and your affiliation if you have any today. Next slide. Awesome. So we're going to do a brief introduction of ourselves. So my picture is on the far left. I'm wearing a traditional Indian sari that is red with some orange yellow in it. So I grew up in Southern California, and my parents immigrated there from India in the 80s. Myself and my siblings were born there, and I moved up to Spokane in 2014 for college, and I stuck around because I just really fell in love with Spokane. And it took a while because coming from Southern California, Spokane was very different demographically. So it took a while to find my home here, but getting involved with APIC was really how I found that place of home, and I've loved it ever since. And I'm also the co-chair for APIC alongside Ryann. And yeah, I'm going to pass it to Tia.
Hi again, everyone. My name is Tia. I'm the current college intern for APIC Spokane. I was born and raised here in Spokane, Washington, and I'm currently a junior at Gonzaga University. I'm studying communication studies and sociology and planning on minoring in solidarity and social justice. I'd say a reason why I really wanted to join APIC is because I really care about social justice and getting involved in my community. And this was like a perfect opportunity to really meet my community and hear about their needs and their desires for how Spokane can grow and change to be more culturally inclusive of our API community. So I really have enjoyed just all of the work that we do at APIC, whether that be like lobbying or helping people get counted in the census or helping people register to vote. It's just been like really meaningful work for me. And I'll pass it, oh, and sorry, my outfit, I'll describe it really quick. So I'm Hmong American, like I said, and my outfit is a more modern Hmong dress with a red sash, and I have like a necklace too that's silver. And I'll pass it on to Ryan.
This is Ryan again. My picture on the right shows me wearing traditional bicycling protest gear. I'm wearing a helmet and a Patagonia vest. I'm originally from Southern California. I'm Chinese American, and I came up to Spokane to study architecture at WSU. Currently, I work for an architecture firm. I'm also the co-chair of AAPI with Sarah, and I also am the founder of Reimagine Spokane. And part of Reimagining Spokane is empowering people to also be able to do that. And one of the reasons why I joined AAPI is to help Asian and Pacific Islander folks in our community to also feel like this is home and that they have a place where their ideas and their creativity and culture can exist. Next slide, please.
So now I'm going to talk about us as an organization. AAPI, we are the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition Spokane, and we're a statewide network of community organizations dedicated to advancing and restoring the civil and human rights of and racial and economic justice for all Asians and Pacific Islanders in solidarity with Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. So our organization was created after the 1996 Welfare Reform Act significantly impacted and reduced non-citizens' federal eligibility for public assistance programs. Recognizing that need for a collective voice advocating for the rights and equity of foreign-born Asian and Pacific Islanders, AAPI formed to lobby the Washington State Legislature to address that gap created by federal legislation. Building off of this legacy, every year, AAPI chapters from King, Pierce, Snohomish, Yakima, Spokane, and South Puget Sound counties bring together Asians and Pacific Islanders from all across Washington state to meet with local legislators to advocate for issues that are most impactful to our communities. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about Asian and Pacific Islander hate and racism, the history behind it, and current events. Next slide, please. So first, I want to talk about the root there we go. First, I want to talk about the root causes of anti-Asian hate and violence, which are white supremacy and systemic racism. So white supremacy and systemic racism have oppressed Asians and Pacific Islanders for decades and continue to harm those communities to this day. White supremacy and racism are both evident in the perpetual foreigner stereotype and the model minority stereotype, both of which I'm about to explain. So the perpetual foreigner, that stereotype, it labels us as outsiders who will never truly be American and who are viewed as often less patriotic and less similar to other Americans. Anti-Asian xenophobia and racism dates back to the 19th century when the Page and Chinese Exclusion Acts shut out would-be immigrants. And it peaked during World War II with the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans. To this day, Asian American individuals face that harassment and racism rooted in that perpetual foreigner stereotype. It's the notion that we are foreigners and outsiders, and it makes us easier targets where people can direct their frustration, anger, aggression, because we've also seen that xenophobia and anti-Asian violence during this pandemic. A lot of people have scapegoated Asian Americans for this pandemic, which has been really, really disappointing and disheartening to see. Also, there's the model minority myth, and it's a stereotype that Asians are smart, polite, successful, law-abiding, hardworking, and socioeconomically thriving model citizens who are shining examples of overcoming racism and discrimination to live the American dream. It also claims that Asian Americans have the correct work ethics and values, but the stereotype was created during the civil rights era, and it's actually a tool by white supremacy to pit Black Americans against Asian Americans, and pretty much to try to divide minority groups in general. This myth is very harmful because although it may look really good on the surface to be labeled as the model minority and as somebody that people should aspire to be like, it's actually very harmful because it masks the diversity of the Asian American experience as we're very diverse in terms of income and educational attainment and more. And it creates the perception that Asian Americans are not considered to be people of color and that we are immune to racism, which is not true at all. So when we do speak up about racism, our experiences are usually dismissed because of that model minority stereotype. And really quick, I just want you all to look at the graph right there. So it's just a graph explaining Asian American and Pacific Islanders incomes and just how diverse that is. So it's very harmful to label all Asian Americans as successful, income-wise or otherwise. As you see here, there's such a diversity and wide range in income based on each ethnic group. And like I said, I'm Hmong American. And if you see down there, Hmong Americans actually on average have one of the lowest incomes on average, like in comparison to other ethnicities. Hmong Americans right now, 60% of them live in are low income. So it's just very harmful to label all of us as the same, high income, high achieving people when it's like, that's not the truth. And that's all stemming from white supremacy and systemic racism. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about the rise in anti-Asian hate during the COVID-19 pandemic. So according to Stop AAPI Hate, from March 2020 through March 2021, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders had faced 6,603 hate incidents since the pandemic began, which is over a 150% increase from the previous year. And of course, this number could be even higher due to underreporting and barriers to technology and language barriers. These reported incidents range from insults, verbal harassment, and jokes, such as referring to COVID-19 as the Kung Flu, to violent attacks in businesses, schools, and other public spaces. So during this coronavirus pandemic, Asian Americans are not only grappling with how to avoid the virus, but we're also dealing with racism in the form of verbal attacks and physical attacks. For example, a 16-year-old boy in California's San Fernando Valley was physically attacked by bullies in his high school who accused him of having the coronavirus simply because he is Asian American. Elderly Asians are more frequently victimized too. Among them was 84-year-old Thai man Vicha Ratanapakdi, who was shoved to the ground while taking a walk in San Francisco, and he later died of his injuries. In Midland, Texas, an Asian American father and his toddler were slashed across their faces at a Sam's Club. One of the main causes to this huge uptick in anti-Asian hatred is because Donald Trump has scapegoated China for his own failed COVID-19 responses, which has spurred anti-Asian attacks. So the use of that racist language like the Chinese virus or the Kung Flu is very problematic because it is racist language used to try to scapegoat Chinese people, but also Asian Americans in general for the pandemic, when it's like, it's not, it shouldn't be any ethnic, there should never be blame placed on any culture or any ethnicity at all. So next slide, please. Pass it to Sarah.
Thanks, Tia. So if I asked any one of you or even any of us presenting right now to name all of the countries and communities that are included under the API label, most of us would probably fail to mention every single one because there are so many that fall within this enormous umbrella label. Within this group, there are East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians, and Pacific Islanders, which has been brought in to include Native Hawaiians as well under the NHPI label. There are unique histories and struggles within the groups that are considered API, even before you begin to look at conflicts between Western nations. We do not share the same nation or creed. We don't even share the same language. And in fact, there are hundreds of languages represented throughout our communities. Looking at this region on the map, it encompasses billions of people, and that's not including folks who have since moved to different countries. If we look at our communities within the US, there are about 22 million Asian Americans, which makes up nearly 7% of the total population, and an estimated 1.6 million NHPIs, and these numbers are projected to grow. According to a new report from the Pew Research Center, Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the US. All of this is to say that our community is not a monolith, and we are a diverse people, and there is a growing number of us. So it is about time that we start to recognize the nuances that exist between us. One of the ways we can start to do this is by disaggregating the label API and look at the disparities that exist within our communities, especially between Asian Americans and NHPIs. Next slide, please. So Tia talked earlier about the model minority myth, which posits that APIs are super smart and wealthy, etc. So I thought it would be good to start with education as an example of how that isn't necessarily true or accurate when you split up different Asian communities and different NHPI communities. So ideally, we'd like to see this data broken down even further than just the larger labels, which you can do on AAPI Data's website. But this is still a good illustration on the large disparities that exist. So if we compare Asian alone or combo, which are the top two, to NHPI alone or combo, you see a big difference between those who received a BA degree or higher, which is in red, and those who received less than a high school level education in blue. Next slide, please. So this bar chart shows the poverty levels that exist between groups. And if we look at the Asian categories and the NHPI categories, you can see a big disparity there as well. Next slide, please. So many people use Asians and NHPIs as this model example when it comes to immigration. While this isn't one of the central stereotypes that gets conveyed when we are talking about things like the model minority myth, it is something that comes up a lot with more conservative talking points around the immigration system. There's this perception that APIs immigrated the quote unquote right way, which is super problematic in many ways, but it also pits our communities against others that also have immigrant stories of multiple statuses. Instead of creating solidarity over a common issue, it divides us. So this chart is a good illustration of showing how the issue of immigration, particularly documentation, impacts our communities different. So when we're thinking of issues like with ICE and CBP, what kind of translation materials do we have to teach folks about their rights? How are we making sure people are receiving accurate translations for their immigration hearings? Even for the example of India being the top category, there are hundreds of languages spoken in India alone, let alone comparing that to all the other countries that are represented on this slide. So this is a classic example, you know, when you're in algebra class growing up, when they talk about mean, median, and mode. So if you're always grouping groups together and just taking the middle from all of it, you miss out on the huge disparities that exist between the communities. So that's why we are really pushing for folks to pay attention to the data they're looking at. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it on to Ryann.
Thank you, Sarah. We'll go into police, racism, and violence and the impacts on Asians and Pacific Islanders. Next slide, please. So as Tia mentioned earlier, that there's over 6,600 incidents reported to one organization that is recording hate incidents, Stop AAPI Hate. And these incidents happen at people's houses, in public parks, on the streets, and online. And sometimes it feels like hiding behind a mask or in a group of people protesting for your rights and humanity are the safest places to be if I have to be out and about. But living in fear for my safety is not something I ever thought I'd want, that I ever thought would become a source of anxiety for me, but my life and health are not something that I want to take for granted. And in these bad scenarios that run through my head, I know that I have to choose wisely on who I would call when in a vulnerable state. Next slide, please. So one of the first phone numbers that I learned when I was a kid was 911. And also as a kid, I remember playing cop and that always involving a gun. So the picture post on the left by Kiesha points out what's problematic, yet so true about our idea of police. And she asks, or she says, if you ask a child in your life to act like a cop and they instinctively put up finger guns and yell freeze, you have to ask yourself if police exist to protect or exist to persecute. And on the right is a post by Oliemi Olorin, who says, who you're going to call when insert crime happens if we abolish police is not a gotcha. In that hypothetical, the crime already happened and the police neither prevented or stopped it. And the abolition is about prevention and it's about changing the conditions that lead to the crime. Next slide, please. Had we known about addressing the deeper issues as kids, our policing game would have looked a lot different and may not have happened at all. But the reality is that the one wielding the gun always got the kill, and back then, simply playing dead had no real consequences. The underlying problem with policing isn't just a lack of oversight, policies, more training, or better procedures. From their inception, police have been tasked with protecting power and privilege by exerting social control over people of color. The real life consequences of police are that they murder people of color at disproportionate rates. And as you can see by this picture, there's 36 portraits by Ori Original, and this piece is called Justice for Our Lives. It's a digital portrait series of 100 people killed by US law enforcement since the beginning of the 21st century. This project is a visual aid to support the struggle led primarily by impacted families and activists against state-sponsored terrorism that targets communities of color and other marginalized victims. Next slide, please. So every 3 seconds, a person is arrested in the United States. According to the FBI, of 10.3 million arrests a year, only 5% are of offenses involving violence, which means that 95% of all other arrests are for nonviolent offenses. These include many relatively minor infractions like money forgery, which is the alleged crime that the cops who killed George Floyd arrived to investigate, or selling single cigarettes without a tax stamp, the crime that Eric Garner lost his life for, or for marijuana or other drug possession. Mappingpoliceviolence.org is a database of maps and charts that aim to provide some insights into patterns of police violence across the country. They include information on over 9,000 killings by police nationwide since 2013. This information has been meticulously sourced from official police use of force data collection programs in states like California, Texas, and Virginia, combined with nationwide data from Fatal Encounters database, which is an impartial crowdsourced database on police killings. Mapping Police Violence has done extensive original research to further improve the quality and completeness of the data, searching social media, obituaries, criminal records databases, police reports, and other sources to identify the race of 90% of all victims in the database. The website also notes that 98.3% of killings by police from 2013 to 2020 have not resulted in officers being charged with a crime. So the chart shown on the right shows the data from 2013 to December 2020, and it's showing the average police killings rate per 1 million people, ranking police from deadliest to least deadliest. As you can see by this arrow pointing to the 3rd row, that Spokane is the 3rd most deadly police department behind St. Louis and Oklahoma City, and that Black people were killed 3.3 times the rate of white people. Also in Spokane, you'll see that Black Spokane residents are 5 times more likely to be arrested. Native Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested than white people in a year. Spokane police continue to disproportionately stop Black, Native American, Middle Eastern, and Pacific Islander residents, and that Native Americans are 49% more likely to have force used against them than whites. Next slide, please. These findings don't cover murders within the Asian Pacific Islander communities, but that doesn't mean that they don't happen. The police murder of Vietnamese American citizen Tommy Lee happened over 4 years ago in Seattle. A neighbor called 911 saying that a man was acting bizarre and threatening people with a knife or some sort of sharp object. 3 deputies showed up, 2 fired lasers when Lee wouldn't stop, and the deputy who fired fatal shots said that he feared for his life and had no other choice but to use deadly force. It was later revealed that Lee was holding a pen. Next slide, please. Almost a year ago, a 19-year-old Chinese American adoptee named Christian Hall was murdered by Pennsylvania state troopers after he called to say he was having a suicidal episode. Troopers showed up, and after about an hour and a half standoff, Christian walked with his hands raised, carrying what looked like a gun towards the troopers, and he was still killed. The weapon in his hand turned out to be an airsoft gun. Next slide, please. Shortly after the murder of Christian Hall in Pennsylvania, another police murder happened back in Spokane. After fleeing from a police stop on January 10th, 2020, and crashing into a tree, a 25-year-old Marshallese man named Clando Anatok continued on foot into a backyard and turned toward the deputy and reached into his waistband. He was shot once in the head and pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators did not recover any weapons from the scene. These three men of Asian and Pacifica descent were shot and killed by police despite having no actual firearm on them. Next slide, please. Then earlier this year on March 16, 2021, the mass shootings occurred in Atlanta, Georgia, where a white man murdered 8 people, 6 of them of Asian descent. The gunman walked away from the scene alive, and the sheriff's captain claimed that the shooter had a bad day. A bad day? When I have a bad day, I cry and eat ice cream. We really need to help people deal with their bad days in a way that doesn't end in the loss of life. This dismissive statement by Atlanta sheriff also just goes to show how white supremacy and police culture make it seem that the white shooter who killed 8 people, most of whom were of Asian descent, was at all acceptable. And I'm not saying that the white gunman had to be killed, but it just makes me question how easily cops kill people of color holding pens, airsoft guns, or having no weapons at all. To add more insult to injury, these murders in Atlanta were not classified as a hate crime by the Cherokee County. But if yelling, "I'm going to kill all Asians" while killing multiple Asian people is not an indication of a hate crime, then what is? Could it be that police and the law are used to reinforce a system of racism that works exactly as intended? Next slide, please. Additionally, some of you may have heard of the school to prison pipeline. In Southeast Asian communities, there are instances where prison is not the last stop. The Southeast Asia Resource Action Center talks about Southeast Asian American youths who came to the US in the 1970s as children who were fleeing war and persecution in their families. As seen on the photo on the right, the Southeast Asian Americans were and still are subject to the same systemic marginalization as many other communities of color in the US. Failing schools, multi-generational poverty, racial profiling, over-policing, and mass incarceration. Yet for immigrant youth who have not been naturalized, the school to prison pipeline may end in deportation and permanent family separation. Southeast Asian Americans are 3 to 5 times more likely to be deported on the basis of an old criminal conviction compared with other immigrant communities. Deportation is automatic and mandatory for immigrants, including lawful permanent residents with any of a wide range of old criminal records, regardless of the unique facts of their cases. Individuals always serve their full criminal sentence before they're deported. One of the officers involved in the George Floyd murder was of Southeast Asian descent. And in an article commenting on the Hmong police officer, there have been criticisms of local Minnesota Hmong people in support of defunding police. Some Hmong believe that you can't be pro-Hmong and pro-Black. Next slide, please. This anti-Black, pro-police sentiment among any people of color is a detriment to all of our communities of color. Unfortunately, these people of color that still think that more policing is the answer may not understand how their actions perpetuate white supremacy and also undermine the work of other POC communities. On this slide, people of color are shown as 2 Spider-Mans pointing at each other in blame, while on the left, Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars, aka white supremacy, watches on and sees that his plan to pit people of color together is good. A writer from Vox reminds us that there's a failure to remember what America got to this place of racial hierarchies and lingering Black Asian tensions, which is white supremacy. White supremacy is what created segregation, policing, and scarcity of resources in low-income neighborhoods, as well as the creation of the model minority myth, all of which has driven a wedge between Black and Asian communities. In fact, it is white Christian nationalism more than any other ideology that has shaped xenophobic racist views around COVID-19. And for Black and Asian American communities to move forward, it's important to remember the root cause and fight together against it. Next slide, please. In Spokane, there are several ways for communities to unite against white supremacy, and one of them is through SCAR's platform for change. And you might have heard of SCAR earlier, who was in this conference as well. Spokane Communities Against Racism, or SCAR, works as a police watchdog for the community, identifies white supremacy and racism within our local police force, and calls for systemic change. Their demand for transformational change calls for defunding the police and investing in community, changing police culture, police oversight, and justice reforms. Next slide, please. The disproportionate violence and murders of police against people of color continue to prove that police are not here to protect all people equally. This Ghostbusters picture of ghost prohibition could double as an anti-white supremacy, anti-racist campaign, but also asks us again, who are we going to call when we're in need? Next slide, please. When it comes to combating anti-Asian hate, discrimination, and violence, we're looking at intersectional solidarity, bystander intervention, Asian American 101, and education and community-based solutions. Next slide, please. So moving forward in intersectional solidarity, learning and healing together looks like a few different things. Next slide, please. On the left of this slide is a screenshot of Margaret Lynn's article, Why Only Multiracial Solidarity and Restorative Justice Can Solve Racial Attacks on Asian Americans. But why nothing else? Well, if you think about it, nothing else has worked so far. And not only are we after multiracial solidarity, we're looking at intersectional solidarity. Intersectionality is a term that was coined in 1989 by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. Though the term intersectionality was coined over 30 years ago, it seems to be coming up a lot in social justice conversations today. Although the term intersectionality is thrown around a lot, not many people have an accurate understanding of what it means, or they're flat out against it. To some folks who are more resistant to understanding social issues, the term intersectionality is dangerous because it creates a false sense of victimization of both the dominant population and marginalized people. For the white dominant population, fears that racial and cultural hierarchies will be replaced with a new one, and that they place innocence on their privilege. Marginalized folks may be further labeled on how oppressed they are, but we believe that intersectionality can be and should be used for good. On the right is a post by the Spectrum LGBTQ+ Center about 7 LGBTQ+ API pioneers that changed history. Asians and NHPI do not often come to mind when thinking about the queer community or being professional athletes or struggling in school or finding a job or housing, yet each of us have unique experiences and histories that can help us connect with people going through similar situations. These common grounds help break down barriers of racism and hate. Next slide, please. So AAPI's recent COVID vaccine clinics have been perfect examples of how we can work in coalition with different heritages and identities to prioritize marginalized communities to help save people's lives. The Native Project, an Indigenous health clinic, reached out to AAPIC along with several other communities of color to vaccinate our communities without having to abide by the tiered age restrictions, because in our communities, particularly with Indigenous folks, they don't typically live to age 65. The Spectrum LGBTQ+ clinic was a powerful event showing the need for creating a safe and inviting environment for queer folks and people of color that bring health services to the people while reshaping the ideas of institutional medicine. These partnerships with the organizations was empowering and enforced AAPIC's vision for creating our own institutions that properly serve our people. Next slide, please. So I also represent AAPIC in environmental and housing discussions within the city. And as someone that works in the architecture field and has a mind for putting people and planet first, I advocate the best I can for our Asian and Pacific Islander communities, who make up a large portion of the rental population in Spokane, along with other people of color. Collectively, people of color are also minority users of our outdoors, despite nature being found in our backyards. It's nearly impossible to dissociate environmental justice and social justice in my mind, because we're all inhabitants of this planet, and also because people of color are most impacted by climate crisis, pandemics, unrestricted rent increases, and lack of transparency or accountability in our system of oligarchic capitalism. Next slide, please. I'll pass
Awesome.
it back to Sarah.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our advocacy work, different legislation, education, and things happening in the community. Next slide. Perfect. So some of you might be familiar with this recent piece of legislation that passed federally, but earlier this year, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was signed into law. The legislation introduced by Representative Grace Meng and Senator Mazie Hirono aims to make the reporting of hate crimes more accessible at the local and state levels by boosting public outreach and ensuring reporting resources are available online in multiple languages. It also directs the Department of Justice to designate a point person to expedite the review of hate crimes related to COVID-19 and authorizes grants to state and local governments to conduct crime reduction programs to prevent and respond to hate crimes. So the act is a good start and has good intentions, but it only really addresses hate crimes, so not hate incidences or discrimination. Hate crime classifications and statistics do not change the structural conditions that lead to violence against marginalized communities. In fact, over 85 Asian American and LGBTQ+ groups oppose this bill because the legislation fails to provide resources to address the causes of anti-Asian hate, and in turn ignores police violence against Black and Brown communities. It's important when looking at potential legislation that we consider solidarity work and be sure of unintended consequences of something that might look good on the surface level. In Spokane, an anti-Asian hate resolution was signed by our city council, but again, this doesn't do much to address the root causes of hate and discrimination, and it fails to provide resources for anti-Asian bias and merely condemns hateful acts. Also, when hearing that the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act notes that local governments have their own responsibility to respond to hate crimes and conduct crime reduction programs, it enables different municipalities to continue to drag its feet on equity issues. Next slide. So it's important that advocacy work isn't done just at the national level, but also at the local level too. So Greater Spokane Progress is a coalition of over 40 social and environmental justice organizations, including AAPI, and the Spokane Human Rights Commission has been pushing for a well-funded, well-staffed, multifaceted Office of Civil Rights. This process continues to be an uphill battle with the local government. An Office of Civil Rights would be utilized to address the workplace discrimination that happens, negative work environments that stifle people's work, the city's inability to retain extremely talented staff of color in high-level positions, and the lack of an infrastructure for the city to independently investigate accusations. Next slide. In Spokane, we have an opportunity to empower the voices of people of color. The Spokane Coalition of Color consists of AAPI, the NAACP, HBPA, which is the Hispanic Business Professionals Association, and MCAS, which is Muslims for Community Action and Support. And all four of us work together to build candidate forums to bring issues to people running for local office and to hold candidates responsible for considering our communities at the forefront because they are tasked with representing all of us. This is important to us in order to get proper representation for our communities, but also to bring these folks into our spaces instead of the burden being on our community members to seek them out. As new co-chairs of AAPI, Ryan and I believe we need to work together on a more regular basis as a coalition because Spokane's only progressive coalition of color. We're not only like strength in numbers, because here in Spokane, our numbers are very small, but also because all these issues impact all of our communities. So working together ensures that we do not leave any voice out, because even within our Asian community, we cannot speak to every single person's individual and unique experience. We know that we must empower people to be able to speak for themselves, to put political pressure on elected leaders to act, and we must create safe places to do so. Next slide. And I'm going to pass it back to Tia.
So one important method to combating anti-Asian hate and racism are bystander intervention trainings. So you can participate in free bystander intervention trainings to be better equipped to intervene and assist somebody who is being attacked or harassed with that victim's consent, of course. So there are free bystander intervention trainings that are all virtual, hosted by Asian Americans Advancing Justice and Hollaback. Feel free to screenshot this slide or take a picture of it so you can check out that website and register for those free bystander intervention trainings. You can learn more about like conflict de-escalation, bystander intervention to stop anti-Asian harassment, and you can also learn how to respond to that anti-Asian harassment. And I've attended one of those trainings and it's been super, super helpful, so I highly recommend it. Next slide, please. So another important, very significant method to combating anti-Asian hatred is Asian American history being taught in schools and education. So in order to affect lasting and meaningful change, we need a mandatory educational campaign starting in K through 12 schools that reveals the strength and complexity of Asian Americans. At the core of anti-Asian racism is the assumption that Asian Americans are foreign or other. But that increased education on Asian American history can break those stereotypes that we are foreign. Expanding that education to incorporate a variety of perspectives is a key way to build empathy and critical thinking among students, and it can also help reduce bias. While that's definitely far from the only thing that's needed, adding Asian American history in schools is viewed as a key way to help prevent anti-Asian attacks moving forward. So when textbooks discuss anti-Asian racism, they usually gloss over the severity of the discrimination that people endured. Only a few history lessons address the attacks on hundreds of South Asian immigrants in Bellingham, Washington, in the early 1900s as white workers sought to drive them out, or the mass lynching of Chinese American immigrants in Los Angeles in the 1870s. Schools should also teach about the history of racist legislation like the Page Act of 1875 or the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Also, schools can teach on the origin of stereotypes like the model minority myth and the racist history of the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans. So if you see this image right here, there is a sign reading, "I'm an American," on a grocery store in Oakland, California, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 8th, 1941. The store was closed and the Matsuda family who owned it, they were relocated and incarcerated under the US government's policy of internment of Japanese Americans. So it's just really important to know that even though we are Americans, like even though I am an American, some people may see me as not an American or as different and a perpetual foreigner just because of the way that I look. And this image was just very, very striking to me and heartbreaking to me because no matter how hard this Matsuda family and other Japanese American families tried to assimilate, no matter how hard they tried to be seen as American, just as other white Americans, they were still incarcerated and were still seen as a threat to America, even though they were just as American as others. So that was just a really, really striking and powerful image, very sad image to me. Schools should also teach about the diversity of Asian Americans because there's such a big diversity in terms of education, income, histories, traditions, and beliefs among all different Asian cultures. Also in Asian American 101 classes, schools can educate on how there are so many different ethnic groups within that Asian label, so we cannot be seen as a monolith. Something that's seen as a really great step forward is that the Illinois governor, J.B. Pritzker, has signed legislation requiring that Asian American history be taught in public schools starting in the 2022-2023 school year. And Illinois is the first state in the US to do so. It's called the Teaching Equitable Asian American History, or TEACH Act. So the governor is saying that he hopes that by teaching students about Asian American history, it can help combat false stereotypes and reduce bias. And this new curriculum will add a new unit for every public elementary school and high school to learn about Asian American history, specifically in Illinois and the Midwest. It'll also teach about different Asian Americans who advanced civil rights and the contributions that Asian Americans have made in government, sciences, the arts, economics, and politics. So this is a very positive model for what other states in the country can do to combat anti-Asian racism. Hopefully soon, with the momentum from the Stop Asian Hate movement, other states will follow suit and mandate the education of Asian American history in K through 12 schools. Because after all, Asian American history is American history too. I want to share a little bit about my experience growing up in Spokane. So I personally realized that growing up in a predominantly community of Spokane, I was barely taught anything about Asian American history. I was only given one presentation in 8th grade by my Japanese teacher about the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans and how his grandparents were actually forced into incarceration camps and how devastating and horrible those conditions were, how not too many people even survived them. So as a Hmong American woman, I would have loved to learn more about the history of Asian Americans, but not only the racism and discrimination, but also the contributions that Asians have made into society, because I think that representation is so important. The lack of reading about or learning about any Asian American activists like Yuri Kochiyama or Grace Lee Boggs, it made me really question, are Asian Americans even involved in politics or in civil rights? Like, I just didn't know because I had never learned about it. And it wasn't until college that I learned about how influential Asian American activists, like I said, Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, and so many more, were in fighting for civil rights and for so many other movements too. So I had to go the extra mile to even learn about my own Hmong history, like how Hmong people were recruited by the CIA to fight alongside US soldiers in the Vietnam War, and how Hmong soldiers died at a rate of 10 times the amount of American soldiers in Vietnam. I also had to do more research on how Asian Americans have fought for workers' rights or the farm labor movement. But I think that it would really positively impact Asian American students to see and learn about leaders who look like them, which sends that message that our lives matter and our stories are worth sharing. So Asian American History 101 classes can help students of all races to learn more about the diversity of Asian American experiences, the racism that we have faced in the past and still in the present day. And this history can help combat stereotypes that Asian Americans are foreigners. Next slide, please. So here are a few recommended books to read about the Asian American and Pacific Islander experiences. There's Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning by Kathy Park Hong. There's also The Making of Asian America, A History by Erica Lee. There's Iep Jaltuk, Poems from a Marshallese Daughter by Kathy Jetnil Kitchener. And This is Paradise by Christiana Kahakawila. So please check out these books. I started reading Minor Feelings, and Sarah has also, and it's so good. I really, really love it. And I think that I've really connected to all the stories that she tells in there, but please read these or check out more lists on your own, do your research. Next slide, please. And I'll pass it to Ryan.
Thank you, Tia. So what would community-based solutions look like? Ideally, there would be solutions for the community, by the community. We should be asking the community what they need. And first off, do we even know what they are? So AAPI is working on a comprehensive health needs assessment for our Asian communities. It's the first one of its kind. And as far as knowing exactly what people need is kind of hard because, like Tia mentioned earlier, the access to technology or just being in the loop of the dominant narrative is not as easy for some API communities. But some of these examples here on the left is from Designing Justice. They're a local real estate developer nonprofit that actually is transforming spaces to be more geared towards restorative justice and community. Some of their examples are of a mobile classroom, women's refuge trailer, and a pop-up village. And on the right is a photo of the Filipino Community Center from a tour that we took as co-chairs out in Seattle. And this was one of the sites that really inspired us to really start focusing on what people need directly here in Spokane and how we can help build up support for them. And as Nikki Lockwood mentioned in the chat, we also have a local Spokane educator named Denny Yasuhara who worked on civil rights for Japanese Americans nationwide, and we just named a new middle school after him. So having some of that recognition within our community is really important for showing that there are Asians and Pacific Islanders in our community and that we have made a difference here. Next slide, please. And so these two photos of Asian people marching for Black lives are indicative of these people's understandings that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as Martin Luther King Jr. put it. So when thinking of laws and policies that we currently have or ones that are being revised or proposed, we ask you as law professionals or social workers, or even as everyday people, to think critically about who these laws are protecting and to reimagine policy and law enforcement in a way that empowers all people and to help foster a community where everyone can thrive. Next slide, please.
Awesome. So this presentation might have been a lot to process, and the work definitely doesn't stop here. There's a lot to dismantle, but there is strength and resilience in partnership and coalition with one another. So continue to do research without relying necessarily on impacted communities to educate you. Be genuinely interested in knowing who we are and what we go through, and build authentic relationships with people in your communities. So you can find us at Facebook. So that's at APIC Spokane, on Instagram at APIC_Spokane official. And then our emails are below if you want to contact us directly. But we're going to open it up for a quick Q&A. Yes. So Jen asked, can you please put the book titles in the chat? We can totally do that. Tia is typing right now. Does anyone else have any questions? We have about 7-ish minutes. If not, and we did this like super great job. Also, apology if you see me looking over. Ryan is in the room with me. There's their arm. Yeah, we have really enjoyed spending this time with you all. We're always accessible through social media or our emails if anything comes up. Yes, tech support. So if you would like to ask verbally instead of typing into the chat, you can raise your hand and a host can unmute you if you prefer that method. But if something comes up later in the rest of your sessions or something in your daily life and you want to email us about it, please feel free to do so. Tia's putting some stuff in the chat too. Someone asked, what is your view on first-generation immigrants from API region in the community who are not yet identifying themselves as Americans? This is a great question. Yeah, do any of you have initial thoughts? Looking around. I know for me, it depends on which family member I'm talking to. My parents, having immigrated in the 80s, they've lived in the US for 40 years now. And there's still this identity of belonging to home. And I think it's hard within the US when our communities are so spread out here. So still wanting to identify as the community that we come from. Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. And I think, in my opinion, it's different for every person and family. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Sarah. I think it's different for every person. I have an auntie who immigrated here from Thailand about 8 years ago, and she identifies as American. I don't think it was very difficult for her to really, jump into that label of being American, since she did become a citizen immediately. I think that's a really interesting question because personally, I wouldn't judge. I would be like, it could be sort of difficult sometimes to like full on label yourself as different when you personally feel like you still have a part of you belonging to home. I personally identify as Hmong American because I feel like I'm of both cultures, both Hmong culture and American culture. But most people who I know are very proud of being American, like most Hmong people and stuff. They're like very proud of being Hmong and very proud of being American. Yeah.
I think also assimilation has a part to play. My name is Sarah. My siblings also have very Western sounding names. And part of that was for the ease of living in the States and having a name people could pronounce. So it was definitely a decision that has to be made. And I think, yeah, it's a very interesting question. Ryan, do you have any thoughts?
I guess my take on whether or not people identify as Americans also depends on like where you live and who the people are around you, and like how open the community is to different cultures and a place for you to exist. Because when like some people might think to be an American, like you have to be white, but that's not what America should be. I mean, it is, our country is founded on ideas of racism, and I guess I just feel like it would be, I mean, part of Reimagine Spokane is to make Spokane open and safe for all types of people to not just feel American, but just feel like themselves. I think that really an idea of America and being free isn't about like owning property or whatever. It's about being free to be yourself. So that's what I feel like we're trying to obtain here.
Great question. And then someone asked, will we have access to the slides and or recordings? And I think that's a question for our lovely hosts.
Yes, we will be making recordings available after the conference, and we'll be emailing all registered attendees when those are available and uploaded.
Thanks, Bonnie. We have 2 more minutes if anyone has any burning last questions. Otherwise, Ryan put in the chat the different readings that we had if you want to jump on those before you get the slides and the recordings. And you can take a picture of this current slide that's on the screen if you want to follow us anywhere. Thank you so much for having us. This was a blast. We had a fun time preparing this for you all. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us.